introduction to Phantograms. A few years ago, I saw my first Phantogram, my first photographic Phantogram, and I just fell in love with the process. And I've been playing with it, when I sat down and realized it, for almost 20 years. Because I started playing with it back in 1980. It's a lot of fun, but most of the people who know how to do this are not real forthcoming about how they do it. And what I'm trying to do today is try to get more people to making Phantograms because I like looking at them. What is a Phantogram? Well, obviously it's the thing that's on the cover of a handout. But if you want a little better definition of it, it's a stereo image that appears to be at an angle to the plane you're viewing it on. Almost everything we do in stereo, we go to great lengths to look at it straight on. We line up our screens, whatever. Phantograms are completely different because they are always perceived as being above, below, or to one side of the surface that they're actually rendered on. The ones I'm talking about today are just the ones like the ones on the handout cover, the ones that seem to float above the page. You can make them look any way you want to. You can have a Phantogram you hold up in the air and the image comes down like this. You can have one that you put on the wall and the image comes out to the side. The mechanics allow you to do almost anything you want to with this, but the way you make each one of those is quite different. So we're only going to talk about the one case where we're shooting an image that sits above the surface of the paper.
Well, how is that different from a regular anaglyph where something is viewing from the screen? That sounds like...
A regular anaglyph is always viewed by holding it up like this. You take the sheet of paper and hold it up in your face to look at it. And the image is either behind that sheet of paper or in front of that sheet of paper. A Phantogram is viewed, it's what's called a virtual real object, if you want to get into descriptive geometry terms. And a virtual real object is an object that has depth in all three dimensions. If you actually look at an anaglyph, it only has depth of 2. You can see back into it, but it doesn't have this kind of depth, the over-the-top kind of depth. It is in a window, basically. And that's the difference. It's a little subtle, but it's sort of like when you see one, you can very easily tell them apart. No anaglyph that you ever make, normal anaglyph, will ever look like a Phantogram. And the mechanics for why they work are completely different. And I'm going to sort of cut the explanation off because when I originally did this presentation, I had about 30 slides explaining the perceptual difference between a regular 3D image and a Phantogram. And it got so technical that it wasn't suitable to an introduction. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to sort of bail out on you there. Why I call them Phantograms, there's a guy named Alidar Hepes, I hope I got the name right, who popularized this technique of drawing images for technical drawings and for use in descriptive geometry textbooks. Descriptive geometry talks to us about how to take a three-dimensional object and render it on paper so that it still looks like a three-dimensional object. It's a very, very complex form of technical drawing. Phantograms are the perfect way to illustrate these textbooks, and I have several of them at home. They're also called stereoscopic anamorphices, phantoglyphs, freestanding anaglyphs, levitated images, which I think is actually a fairly nice term for it, and book anaglyphs. You'll find a lot of German texts that refer to book anaglyphs, and then this kind of image. Phantogram, although some people think it's a trademark, I did an extensive search in the patent database, and it is not, is a name that I kind of like because I like the phanto part of it. That's what they are. They're phantom images. They were used in descriptive geometry texts back to at least 1930. That's the oldest example that I have. I have reason to believe that they go back beyond that point, and I'm dying to find examples. So I keep asking people, if you find them, tell me about them. There was a very good how-to book by Raymond Niceper in 1979 on how to draw these images by using grid, so that you didn't have to do any calculations or understand the principle behind them really, but if you followed the grid and you were a draftsman, you could produce a Phantogram. And a lot of us first ran into these through that book. That's what originally got me very interested in it. Akim Bayer in 1981 started producing these commercially in Germany, and the Federal Postal Service there issued a postcard, the Phantogram on it, to the tune of well over 500,000 of them. So it has been out in the world. It's not a secret technology. The first commercial photos that I know of were done by Boris Starosty in 1998. And I know about those because I have number 3 of his series in my collection at home. And they were quite fantastic. They're a life-size photograph of a nude, and it's like she's sitting there. And I have the 2/3 size version because I couldn't afford the life-size version. There are some patents relevant to this. The first one is by A.J. Macy in 1926, which gives you an idea of how far back it really goes. And he called it a processing method of effective angular levitation of the printed images, which I love the design, the name for that. And what he was trying to do was produce images you could use to replace models in clothing stores, so that they'd have a plane there with like a moving belt on it with images on it, and you could run it up and you'd see the young lady standing there showing off the latest fashions without their having to change clothes, which in those days they actually had live people go around and do this stuff.
Is this the Macy of the department store then?
No, nothing to do with it. Though he does have some other very interesting patents relative to anaglyph printing. He's a very smart man. The most recent patent that I know of is by Owen Western, and he patented a process for photographically making phantograms. There's a reference in the handout for this patent. If you want to go look it up on the U.S. Patent Office website and get the full text, you can. It's kind of an interesting document. From what I can tell, people have been making phantograms since about the 1920s, the mid-1920s. I would love to find an example of a photographic one that dates back to that time period. It's possible to do it, but I can't find any examples that have been done. If anybody finds one, if you will let me know, I will offer some 3D related reward for that you will probably appreciate. We need to have a little word about viewing phantograms, because this actually causes a lot of confusion to people. These images replicate what the human eye sees. If you stop and think about that statement, it implies that when you make your phantogram and you shoot it with the camera, what the eye is going to see is what the camera saw. At the same distance the camera was from the object, at the same height the camera was from the object. At any other point, the phantogram will be distorted or blurred. If any of you have looked at the little phantogram of the ship upstairs in my display, it's kind of fun. You can do this and it kind of waves with the sea, but it very clearly illustrates this problem. You have to look at these from the same point that you shot them. It means you have to be very careful shooting them so that you shoot them in such a fashion that people can do that they're not having to stand back 12 feet and be 6 feet up in the air. If properly done, you can take a ruler, look at the virtual image from the same position you shot it, and make a measurement, go to the real object, and the measurements will match. That's what made them so useful for descriptive geometry text. You could draw an object, and the student could take a protractor or a ruler, and they could take measurements off of that object to see if they were doing it correctly. That is a property that does not exist in any other 3D image that I know of. I've thought about it, and I haven't found an example, but it exists for phantograms. You can do drawings fairly easily if you sit down and think about it. There's a couple of simple formulas that will let you take an object like this water bottle, set it down on a piece of grid paper, start making measurements, and come over here on another piece of grid paper and draw that object as a phantogram. I actually use that to check my phantograms sometimes. If I produce one and it doesn't really work, I'll whip out my ruler, I'll start taking measurements off the thing, and I'll go and start drawing little points on it, and that'll usually tell me where I've messed up, where the distortions are. We are going to work through defining those formulas. And I realize that's a little tedious, but if you understand these, and they are pretty simple, and you can draw them, when you start making photographic phantograms, you can use this to check your work. It also gives you some insight into how they actually work. If you get a book, there's a guy named Wack, I think, W-A-A-C-K, who wrote a nice book, and he has a chapter in it on drawing phantograms. And he has a photo in there, a drawing in there of how to do it. And it shows 2 eye points and a cube, and about 100 lines going this way and that way and the other way to explain it all, and I can never follow it. So I'm going to do this doing the X and Y points separately and treating it like it's 2 separate problems. if you think about the way we look at things, you know, you have your two eyes there, and this line represents the height above this image plane. And I apologize for the terminology. For some reason, when I start making drawings, instead of saying the drawing or the paper, I start dropping back into technical terminology. And this is the distance that the viewer is from the image plane. If we pretend that this is the object we're interested in, and it's something like this laser pointer that doesn't have a lot of points in it, if we look at it with one of our eyes, we come down through here, and that's what we're looking at. But you could project past that point onto this sheet of paper the image of this pen, where it would fall if you were actually drawing it. That's the heart of why phantograms work. In the phantogram, what we're doing is taking each one of the points on the object, and we're projecting it past the object onto the paper. It's what limits the maximum size of a phantogram, by the way, because if I do a phantogram that's going to stand up this high on this table, if you take that and draw like a 45-degree angle, it comes out somewhere over there. That's the ray trace, the viewpoint trace on it. Another important point, all phantograms are designed around the concept that the person's eyes are in the middle of the object that they're looking at. So when you're shooting it, you have to set up where you're in the middle of it. I hope it's intuitive that the Y point for both of those is the same for both eyes, but it is, so you only have to calculate it once. And the way to do that is using something called the similarity of triangles. Now, if you're like me and you've forgotten most of your high school algebra and geometry, the concept may not come natural. But if you look at this single eye point we're looking at here, there's a triangle defined by that large A, large B, and large C. And that triangle goes past our point on the page. Now, we know all the measurements here except this little green bit right here. That's the point that we don't know. We've defined the point on this, the X, Y, and Z points on this, like the laser pointer that we're setting here. We can say it's 6 inches from our viewing plane, it's 5 inches high. You know, we know that pretty precisely. This inner small triangle, we actually know all three sides on, because one of those is the distance from the object, and one of those is the height from the object minus this section. Now, the similarity of triangles say that if the triangles have three angles that are the same, A divided by B on the big triangle is the same number as A divided by B on the small triangle. There are a lot of other things about the similarity of triangles, but this is all we need to know about it. That means that B is equal to this little function right here. So we can calculate the total length of this line from the lines that we know. That's what will let us find that Y function. A practical formula for this, where we go on and we say we have the viewing height here and the viewing distance to there, is this guy right here. It's pretty straightforward, and you can work it in Excel or something in a heartbeat. And what it will do is, for any point you calculate, it will give you the distance. Remember, our X and Y's are defined as this sheet of paper. It will give you the distance out to that point on it. A thing to observe here, by the way, that might strike you. We're at a 45-degree angle, and I always sort of imply that here. Look at what would happen if we drop this angle down. If we drop this angle down to here and we shot it through there, we'd end up someplace down here on this plane. So as you drop the angle you view a phantogram at, the shadow that it casts, the virtual image it casts, gets longer and longer. People who are used to making anaglyphs know that very wide separations are not a good idea. That's why the 45-degree angle is a good idea. It tends to minimize those.
It doesn't quite look like, in your illustration, at least a 45-degree angle. Did you intentionally do that, or?
It's not, yeah, because the angle is actually sort of irrelevant. The
Okay.
method that I use for shooting this, I say 45 degrees because it's the best angle to shoot at.
Right.
If you're anywhere between 30 and 50, or maybe 25 and 50, it's going to work perfectly well.
The
And it doesn't
45
change
tends to be
anything.
your best, your optimal.
For two reasons. One, it tends to minimize this shadow effect, the length of the image, and the other one is that if you take a person and you put something down on a table and you tell him to go over and look at it, he will normally walk up and look at it at about a 45-degree angle. It's just something in the human psyche that tends to do that. So it makes it a pretty good number. Well, we calculated the Y coordinate at that point, and as it happens, it's the same for both eyes. So we now know one of these unknown numbers here. The formulas that other people use for calculating phantogram drawings use the angles. They take the angles into account. They take a whole lot of things. They end up calculating this as the hypotenuse of a triangle, it's the long side of a triangle. It's very messy. I don't like messy. So we're going to look at this like it was a 2D problem, and as it turns out, it works very well as a 2D problem. If we sit here and look at it as a 2D problem, now we're still drawing the same lines to the same point, but we can forget all about the elevation, the angle, the height, and the rest of that. And we're going to fall back on the similarity of triangles again, because we know some of these distances, to define these points. And you notice that for the left eye view, those look like pretty decent numbers. If you started running them, they'd be pretty big numbers. For the right eye view, they're pretty small numbers, aren't they? You know, you start looking at how shallow that triangle is. Don't be surprised if you sit down to do these by hand, if you come out with small fractions, and you start trying to figure out. If you actually draw it, it'll work. And you can sit down and draw a cube in a few minutes this way. Those are the formulas that are practical for calculating these, for calculating the right eye and the left eye view. Notice I have IO here, the interocular divided by 2, just to make my equation a little bit cleaner. And I want to come back to the interocular side of this. You have, if you're into stereophotography, a world of training that there's something called the 1 in 30 rule, or the 1 in 50 rule, or whatever religion you subscribe to. It doesn't apply. What we're talking about here is the interocular distance. So if I set my camera up like this to take a picture of this, I use eye spacing. If I set my camera up back here to take a picture of this, I use eye spacing. What's eye spacing? It's different for everybody. I decided that the stereo realist camera separation was a pretty good one, since a lot of people seem to be able to see those images, and that's what I use for my spacing. But you're talking about something in the, 55 to 70 millimeter range for the separation for normal human beings. And that's the separation you're going to use for your to take these, and the only separations you're going to use. If you start playing with making them big or making it smaller than that, you're going to have a really tough time making a phantogram. You should, if you want to do that, you should wait until you've had more practice. Okay, so drawing them is really pretty simple. You know, we could sit here and draw a simple cube using those equations in a few minutes and make an anaglyph out of this. What about photographing? Well, when I first started asking people who've done this how they did it, this is about the way they explained it to me. First of all, it's really quite simple. You take 2 shots at a given angle. You process the photos to remove the perspective and camera lens distortions introduced by taking the photo. And then you map each of the image point back to the viewing plane. You combine the images in some convenient stereo format, because phantograms don't have to be anaglyphs, and voila, you've got a phantogram. It leaves out 1 or 2 little minor details. And Boris and Terry and Owen Weston and a few other people gave me explanations of this that were pretty much on this level, and it kind of bugged me, so I kind of worked on it. There are 3 ways of making these yourself that are easy, that are sane to do. There's some ways that are almost impossible to do that will work. They are the dual projector method, surface mapping, and what I call perspective transformation. That last is my own term because it defines my own method. Surface mapping, I'm not going to talk about much. Essentially what you're doing is taking your phantogram image, going into a 3D drawing program like Photo Pro, and texture mapping it onto a surface you have predefined to have the right distortions in it. It can be done. I've made a couple of simple ones. It's tedious beyond belief. I don't recommend even trying it. Dual projector is the way Boris Starosty and a number of other people use to take these photos. And you've probably heard them talk about using Bryce, the 3D world modeling program, to do it. Well, that is this method. And the idea behind this method is that I'm going to shoot an image of my object with 2 cameras onto the film plane. I'm going to take those slides that I just made and put them in 2 projectors, and I'm going to project them back at the same angle from the same distance onto a flat surface. So now that image that was up like this will be distorted by the way it's projected back onto the surface. You follow what I'm talking about? Because you're projecting at an angle. You line those 2 photos up, and you have an anaglyph now if you've done the colors right. And you take a 3rd camera, and you look straight down at that image that you're projecting at 45 degrees, and you click a picture. You just made yourself a phantogram. It will work. I tried it about 1981 or 82 when I ran into the book, and I happened to be playing around with Polaroid's the Polaroid land color experiment, where you use 2 projectors and black and white slides and you get full color. Anybody who's ever tried that knows it's maniacally difficult to get it to work. But since I had that stuff there, and I was looking at that Phantogram book by Niceper, I said, you know, I'm going to try this. So I actually tried to do this with physical equipment. In retrospect, it was incredibly dumb, because it has a couple of real problems. First of all, you take your pictures on black and white slide film, because you need anaglyphs. And then you project them back through projectors, but projectors don't have the same lens spacing that cameras do. So you can't get them close enough to replicate the eye spacing or the camera spacing when you originally shot them. So you make them sideways. And even if you do get all of that lined up, color film doesn't do a good job of recording an anaglyph. If you've ever shot one with a regular color film camera, you know, it usually doesn't work very well. So 6 or 7 weeks of tinkering with it, who knows how much film wasted, I ended up with like 1 image you could sort of see, and I gave up on it. Bad idea in the real world, great idea in the virtual world. You go into Bryce and you use 2 virtual cameras to take the Phantogram image, or you import the images as jails, I think they're called in Bryce, to put in, and you make virtual projectors to project them onto a surface, and then you use a virtual camera to take the photo. And you can solve problems like the light fall off that you have and the distortions you have from a real projector in this virtual world. People have used this method and produced exceptionally good Phantograms. Boris does a wonderful job. I know a few other people who do. I found it very hard to do. There's a lot of artistic judgment in it for me. You have to figure out how to get the light intensities right. You have to get everything lined up right. It's pretty tough. What I've discovered is that there's a fairly simple way of doing it in Photoshop. And by the way, I strongly recommend trying this with a digital camera, not a film camera to start with. Because you're going to run through a lot of first attempts before you get it right. There is some really nasty math involved in understanding why it works. I really wanted to explain it, but Suzanne wouldn't let me. You know, you get into the pinhole camera model of how you do perspective transformations from a real image onto the film plane of the camera. And that's pretty interesting math. And then you get into some even more interesting math on how you can project back with the image back onto the plane and take into account the perspective introduced by projecting it onto a plane. It's kind of fascinating stuff. And maybe next year I'll do an advanced Phantogram class for people who are interested in math. We're not going to do any calculations to make these Phantograms. You don't have to do a single one. What we're going to do instead is define a world we're making them in with an alignment grid and a target grid. Back in the days before computers, people used a lot of analog computing in the form of charts and graphs and slide rules, for example. And we're going to use an example of that. The alignment grid is used to set up the camera primarily. And it needs to be at least as large as the biggest thing you're ever going to photograph or print on. Now, there's a way to do this in the real world if you want to take pictures of cars or trains, and you can probably work it out from what we're talking about here. But for the moment, we're talking about tabletop setups that are reasonable to do. The sample target has to be at least as big as the object you're going to set down on it and any shadows it's going to cast. So the ideal behind this is we're going to define a square, a rectangle that our Phantogram will fall in. Typically, since you want to do Phantograms full size most of the time, it's going to be about the same size as you're going to print. The design is quite important. You want the circles, you want the crosses. They have to be at right angles. They can be square, rectangular, anything you want, but you want it to look very much like this. And you can do it in just about any drawing program in a few minutes. The basic camera setup is pretty obvious. We have a camera on a tripod at a 45-degree angle. We have our subject here. You can see that behind it I've got my alignment grid. The camera must be, and here I'm going to get very repetitive, the camera must be in the exact middle of the setup grid. It needs to be exactly in the middle of the space you're defining to put this Phantogram in. The slide bar must be parallel to the grid. I'm trying to emphasize these musts because they can be off a little bit, but cumulative errors in it will totally destroy the image. You must use normal eye spacing for the left and right images. I'm going to say that about a dozen times because I kept messing it up. The camera should point at the center of the object, and that's not quite true. where the camera needs to point, if you tuck the object sitting there like this water bottle, and you kind of drew a rectangle around it in your mind, it needs to point to the center of that rectangle. So like if it casts a shadow off to one side, you know, the rectangle looks like this now, because it has to include that shadow, and the center of the object moves over. You know, it's the center of the fusion plane, I guess would be the technical term, for the image. If that's off a little bit, it won't kill you. The image will just will look a little blurred at the bottom, a little blurred at the top maybe. Alignment is absolutely critical. Spend a lot of time getting this set up right. It's so critical that I'm sure everybody knows how to set a camera up, but I'm going to go through a detailed step on it. Yes?
So I just want to get that point, the object definition includes the shadow created by the object.
It includes anything that's going to be in the final image that you're going to use.
And then, so you center, you create a virtual cube around that and then center it.
A virtual rectangle around it.
Rectangle.
So, you're saying that we do use convergence.
Okay, that's in the advanced class because you could use convergence. In this case, we're not. We have a parallel slide bar, and we're going to shoot without converging the cameras. If you converge the cameras, you need a completely different calibration setup, and the math literally is so
But I
very.
mean, in actual, say, macro photography, you really would not want to converge except in special cases.
You do not want to converge in making phantograms. You know, I've been playing with it. It can produce some interesting results. But
You
it's
let
really-
your eyes do that instead of the camera.
It is a virtual, real object. Your eyes can actually converge on the phantogram. It's an amazing thing. These are the tools that I use to do it, and you can buy them at Home Depot or Lowe's for maybe $50. You don't need all of them, but I'm going to just show them to you anyway. This is a horizontal laser pointer. It's a laser ruler that puts out a line this way across the area. You can often buy those that flip backwards and forth, up or down or sideways. I think I got that one at Costco for about $7 or $8. This one, that's about a 79-cent level. This is called an inclinometer, and carpenters use it to set the level on stairs and things. They're like $5 or $6 at Home Depot. And this is a laser pointer that projects a straight ahead line on the surface. And over here, hiding in the corner, is a plumb bob, a thing you can use to find the level of something, the center of something, hanging wallpaper or something like that. Now, the sequence of operations on doing this is quite critical. I went through a lot of trial and error. If you do them in the same order I do, you'll find that it produces a much better result. The first thing you do is level the tripod and the slide bar. If you're using a real camera, a real stereo camera, of course you don't have to do that. You're leveling the stereo camera. Then set the slide bar to a 45-degree angle, to exactly where you want. I would start out at a 45-degree angle, even if you don't like that. You want to shoot at 30 or you want to shoot at 50, because 45 is very easy to do. You need to put the object you're going to shoot on the grid, mount your camera on the slide bar, look through the viewfinder, and make sure that it's going to fall in the space you've got there. There's nothing more disheartening than going through this setup process, which might take 15 or 20 minutes, and discovering that you don't have the camera and the tripod positioned at the right distance from the object to get it all to fit in. Then I take the laser pointer that projects a straight line, and I'm projecting it right down the center of this alignment grid. Here on the slide bar, I'm hanging the plumb bob right from the center of it. My camera, Suzanne's camera, happens to have the lens and the tripod socket lined up very precisely, so I can just line this up. If your camera does not, hang the tripod, the plumb bob, over the lens of the camera, not over the tripod. As you can see here, the laser dot, if you've got everything lined up right, will hit the string, and then you know that you've actually got this centered onto the grid. This seems a little elaborate. You can do it with a ruler by carefully lining it up. This works much, much better, and it's much, much faster. The last thing we want to do is prove to ourselves that we're actually parallel to our grid. The slide bar is parallel. We know that it's centered now and we've got it at the right angle. So I mount this horizontal laser pointer on it and project it onto the grid. And what you're going to see is a line like this one that runs across. And only by the wildest of circumstances or somebody doing it carefully will it fall on the line. But you can take a ruler or something and measure the difference to make sure you've got it pretty close. You want to get it as close as you possibly can. The errors that you make in the setup of this get tremendously magnified when you take the pictures. So you want to be very careful with it. Once you've got it all set up, what you want to do is put the camera on the tripod, center it with the center position on your slide bar, and take a shot. And I'm assuming you're using a digital camera so that you can do this quickly. If you want to shoot film, find a digital camera, even if it's a relatively low megapixel one, and use it for the setup and things. What we're going to do to check the setup is open that shot we just took in Photoshop. We're going to convert it into a layer, and then we're going to check the alignment by pulling guidelines down over that grid, vertically and horizontally. If you're a Photoshop person, then this is really simple. What I'm doing now is playing a little movie because I don't like running things like Photoshop when I'm trying to explain things to an audience. So what we're doing is opening our shot, and we're going to blow it up to as big a size as is practical. And in the real world, where you don't have time constraints, there's nothing wrong with blowing this really big and scaling it down to see if you've got it right. You see, we've pulled a guideline across, right across our center line, and we've pulled another one right down the middle here. And now we're going to pull a couple more in on these targets. And they kind of define the space that I try to work in when I'm shooting things. Now, a good question you're going to ask is how far off can it be and still work? This is about it, guys. If you look right here, you might be able to see that's off about 3 times the width of that line on both sides. Down here it's off to one side of the center line, and up here it's off to the other side. If you're much more off than that in your setup, you're probably not going to be happy with your Phantograms. This is part of the reason why people who have tried to make these in the past have not had much luck. They didn't understand the precision required. I certainly didn't when I started doing this to get a good result. Now when I say precision and a good result, I mean like the ones upstairs. I want something that looks very, very much like the original object. I can go measure it and it'll come out really close. If you want to take a pretty picture of a flower and you don't care what it looks like compared to the original, you can probably be off 2 or 3 times as much as this and it'll come out. I recommend trying for at least this degree of accuracy. So how do we actually shoot the object? We're going to take that target grid, and I've printed up several. I usually end up printing up one from almost everything I shoot. And we're going to lay it down on top of that alignment grid. And remember, it had the cross lines and the targets on it. You want to center it on the alignment grid, and usually you can see through the paper you printed it on to see the lines underneath so that you get it as well lined up with the alignment grid as you can. So it's as close to center and as well lined up with it. And then we're going to put our object somewhere in that grid with the camera pointing midway up the object, or roughly in the center of the area we're taking the picture of. You want to be really, really careful that all 4 of those targets on the ends are fully visible in the shot, both left and right. It's very typical to shoot the left shot, it looks okay, or shoot the right shot and you discover you've cropped out part of one of those targets. So when you go to process it, you can't use the shots at all. Then we're going to take those shots, and I'm an incredibly anal sort of person. Everything I do, I try to do really precisely and in the same way. I always shoot to the left and then I shoot to the right. But again, remember we're using eye spacing on this. We're using some number you've picked that you think is your typical eye spacing. The procedure is pretty straightforward. We'll open both of the images that we made. We're going to crop them down to they're just the size of the target grid so that anything extraneous on the top, bottom, or sides goes away. And then we're going to use something called a perspective cropping tool in Photoshop. It's a little option in the crop tool to crop out just the rectangle, which now looks kind of like a trapezoid because it got distorted by perspective when we took those shots. Then we're going to size the images back to the original size of the target grids in Photoshop, to exactly the original size. And we're going to save those as the rough left and right files for our Phantogram. Okay? That doesn't sound very complicated. That's how you make a Phantogram. Let's play a movie and go through doing it. First thing we do, of course, is open the 2 files. And since I always shoot left and right, I'm opening the right file at this point. And it's the turtle. It's the same one on the program book. And in fact, we're making the Phantogram I used to print this right now. I made the movie while I made the Phantogram. So the first thing we do is create a new layer and name it right. And I do that mostly so that I can keep it right and left straight as I'm working in Photoshop and moving things around. And then we're going to come up with the regular crop tool, and we're going to come out and crop out the area defined by these guys right here. And we're going to adjust this out. And you notice I'm adjusting to the outer edges of the target. I'm trying to get it to where it's right on the outer edges of these lines here. Let me stop this for a second. The first question that somebody asked me in the last session was, why do you do this? Why do you crop this instead of just doing it as one crop? And the reason for that is if you look right here in the center of this, I don't know if you can see it, Photoshop has this magic center point in its cropping tool that it defines as the center of the image. And especially when you do the perspective crop, that has a strong influence on the result. If the center of this dot is not in the center of our image, the same place in both images, we won't get a phantogram. We're always going to have some extraneous stuff we don't really need here, so we're cropping this down in both images to exactly the same size or as close as we can. That's why we do this crop in 2 stages instead of doing it in 1, because of the way Photoshop handles the centering of images in its perspective correction. I sometimes spend 5 or 10 minutes in this process that we're showing, we're going to spend 30 seconds doing here, to get these lines lined up just exactly on both sides. Okay, now we're coming back and doing that perspective crop. You see up here, we checked this magic little box, but I didn't even know it was there until I started playing with this, to set perspective cropping in Photoshop. And what perspective cropping allows us to do is grab these handles down here and move them out to these 4 targets. So we're no longer cropping a rectangular area, we're cropping a trapezoidal area.
That previous crop that you did, trying to understand what the crop was exactly then, I'm sorry.
What we did, you notice right now we've got it cropped out to where we're right there on that edge of that target.
Right.
And we're right there on that
Yes.
edge of that target.
Okay.
And we're right at
So
the
that's the
top
working area
and
that you
right at the
need,
bottom.
so you're just getting rid of the rest.
But is
You
this
establish the true center.
the true center? We're establishing the true center of this image. That's exactly what we're doing. Because the way Photoshop, it's nice to get rid of the extraneous stuff, but that's not what why we're doing it. We're doing it because if we don't establish the true center of this image when we do this perspective crop, Photoshop will not do it the same in both images. It will not create the perspective shift the same way in both images.
Okay.
As it turns out, by the way, it won't anyway, and someday I want to talk to somebody at Photoshop about that. But it does a pretty close job if you start out by cropping it out. And that's why I use a target that has a crosshair and a circle around it, because I can use the outer edges of this to crop it out. When you're doing that crop, if the lines don't line up exactly right, and if this top line doesn't, or this bottom line doesn't quite hit the bottom of that and quite hit the bottom of that, just do it the same in both images. Do it exactly the same in both images and it'll be okay. Okay, so blow this up as big as you can. I'm not going to go through the 4 or 5 stages that I actually do when I make these, but notice we're pulling these handles out and we're trying to center them in our crosshairs here. This is the most critical phase of making a phantogram. A few pixels mistake here will affect the final result quite a bit. So you want to do as good a job as you possibly can of centering those on the crosshair. And I usually do it as an iterative process. I'll do it, I'll blow it up, I'll go look at the corners, I'll play with them a little bit, try to get them a little bit better. And I may do that 2 or 3 times until I get them the way I think they're right. If you're systematic about things like this, you produce systematic results. If you're not, you sort of get a random result. Okay, so we've sort of got it lined up now. And we're going to check both sides to make sure. And if we like it, we're going to do the little double click thing in the middle and do the perspective crop on it. Looks kind of weird, doesn't it? It got bigger when you did the perspective crop. That's a function of the way Photoshop does it. I'm going to stop this a second. It's a function of the way Photoshop does it that the size of the image will actually change when you do that. So the first thing we have to do is shrink it back down. Now, if you look at that right now, it doesn't look a lot like a phantogram. It doesn't have that sort of distorted look to it that a phantogram normally does. We have to do something else. We have to change the size of this back to its original size. So we're going to use the image size. Now, right now, that's saying it's 6.73 inches by 5.137 inches. Now, I know I used a 9 by 11 target when I built this. So that grid is actually 9 by 11. So I'm going to have Photoshop set it back to 9 by 11. What this will do is take out the distortion that it introduced when it created the perspective change for us. So the image changes its proportions radically. And it starts looking a little more like we expect a Phantogram to look, with that kind of elongated, stretched out look. Notice we left these little half circles in here. They're quite critical. You want to be sure you do not crop them out. So let's save this file, because what we've had is the right rough, and no matter how often I did that, I kept misspelling it, so I finally just left the correction in. We have the right-hand side of our anaglyph, our Phantogram. I'm not going to do the left. We've gone through the procedure once. I hope everybody can sort of follow it. There's some notes in there to help. So we're not going to do the left-hand side. You do the left-hand side exactly the same way, and you try, if you had those lines when you cropped it a little high or a little low, try to make them a little high or a little low when you do the left-hand side, so you're doing them both the same. The next thing we have to do is set the window. And I have a question for the audience. Where's the window? We're making a Phantogram. The window, correct. The window is the surface that the anaglyph, that the Phantogram was shot on. It can have a hole in it that goes down. In fact, you can do some really cute things with holes in the tops of tables and things that look great as these guys. It can have all kind of ups and downs in it. Doesn't matter. The window is always that plane. Now, we're going to have a really easy time setting the window because of the way we made this. But to set the window, we're going to open the left and right rough files. We're going to paste the left into the right file as a layer. We're going to set the opacity or the fill to that layer to where you can see through it. We're going to line these guys up using those targets, crop it to the size we want, and get rid of those targets. And then we're going to take that left layer to create the left file, and the right layer to create the right file. If you're expert at Photoshop, this is a 30-second operation, but I'm going through it on the assumption that people don't know that. So the first thing we do is go up and open both of those files. I always save every file I create at every stage of making something like this, so I can start that. The first thing I do is put the right-hand file on the right-hand side and the left-hand file on the left-hand side. There's no reason for that. I just like the symmetry. And we're going to come over and grab this image and drag it over and drop it on top of the other image, which created a new layer in the Photoshop terms. Then we're going to go down and make that transparent so that we can see through it. And I love Photoshop because it's really easy to do this sort of thing. I was very resistant to it for a long time, but I'm a true convert now. We're going to blow it up as big as is practical so that we can see, and you can see the two images here. And we're going to come down here to these little circles, and they are at the window. So if we line those semicircles up precisely, we have set the window on this image perfectly. And you should do that and ignore what's in the image. If like his foot looks like it's not quite lined up right, that means you made a mistake in the setup or something. Don't try to fix it here. It'll just make things worse. After we get it lined up the way we want it, we'll use the normal cropping tool or the perspective. It doesn't matter as long as you don't pull the points around, to crop this image out to the size we want and to get rid of these little guys. This is usually the point where I discover the shadow falls over one of those and then I have to start all over again. Once we've done that, we have no use for that image again. We just save it. But we can create our left-hand image by going up and selecting everything in the image, the whole top of that layer. And notice over here we've got the left-hand layer selected. And come up and say New File. And if you have this clipboard option selected here, it will automatically create an image the same size as the one we selected here and did that copy on the edit guide. And it'll set it back to exactly the same size. So the two images will be pixel to pixel exactly the same size. And we're going to name it left. I'm not very creative. I named the left one left and the right one right. It's easy to put it back in. We just go up and do a paste, and we have the left-hand side of our Phantogram created. Save it before we mess it up. We've only spent a few seconds on this. When you're actually creating these and you spend 10 minutes lining them up and things, you start investing some time in these images. It's well worth saving them at every stage. We have to come back over here and delete out that left layer we copied in because we don't need it for this side. This is going to be our right image. If you're a Photoshop adroit, you can do this with keystrokes, all these pull-down menus, and it goes really fast. So now write rough, since we've cropped it and everything, we're going to do a save as, so that we don't destroy our write rough file, and we're going to save it as write. And when we do that, we have just created a phantogram. Now, how many people thought it was this easy to do? I mean, all it took was 2 simple operations in Photoshop, basically, and we've done all the manipulation, the trapezoidal distortions, all of this stuff that you've heard about, and it will work just fine.
That's assuming you don't make mistakes.
There's always the assumption, Shab, that you don't make mistakes. But I'm going to go through making a very simple anaglyph out of this file so that you can see it, see what it looks like. And it's also a really good way of doing a really quick test on it. Now, most of the time when I'm making anaglyphs, I go take those 2 images we created, I go into another program like Stereo Photo Factory or Focuscope or something else that does a better job of playing with the colors, because I'm not very good at making anaglyphs. I'm sort of learning how to do that. The way we're going to do that is to open both of those files we created, select just the red channel from the left image, copy it over the red channel in the right image, replacing it, and we'll have an anaglyph that'll work pretty well. And let's play that little movie. The other reason I wanted to do this and show it to people is it is the image on the piece of paper. It sort of adds credibility if you see that we follow the whole process through creating it. Again, we open the left and right, and again I move the right over to the right-hand side. And then we're going to go over and select the left image and go to the channels window. Now, when you go to the channels window, what it's really showing you there is the RGB layers. You can select just one layer to look at if you're not used to using Photoshop. And what you get when you do that is a monochrome image. So we're going to select red. So now we have, that's the information that's in the red channel. We're going to go up and do a select all and then a copy on that. Go over to this guy. Again, we're going to select the red channel. In his image, we're going to do a select all on it. Now, that last little step is kind of important. If you don't do a select all, when you copy this in, it may or may not line up exactly the way you wanted it to and replace all the previous information. So there's a tendency to cut that step out. We'll go up and do an edit and do a paste of the stuff off the clipboard. Now, when we click there, we've got our Phantogram image ready. At this point, you might want to drag out your red-green glasses if you've got them, your anaglyph glasses if you've got them with you, just to show you a cute little effect of playing with Phantograms. The first thing I'm going to do with this guy, get rid of that one, I don't need it, is go up and set the proofing setup on it, because we're going to print these. I print to Epson matte paper, and I have a printer profile and a calibrated monitor system. So I always do that before I forget about it. And then I'm going to save that image, and I'm going to call it anaglyph. Nothing fancy here, just tuck it away somewhere. Now let's blow it up and look at it a little bit. I hope that I think this works on the screen halfway decently as an anaglyph, but what I like to play with is go off and do the variations. I think that produces a kind of a cute effect, because now you have all these little guys standing up on the screen there. And especially if you've used something like, I shoot a lot of little figurines and statuettes. It looks like a little army of people there. I just think it's kind of cute. It's very practical because you can greatly improve your Phantogram sometimes by making a very small change in it by picking it off this screen. And in this case, the way we did the original is probably just about as good as it's going to get without doing a lot of work on it.
What
So
screen
we'll
was
go
it
up
that
and
you,
say-
the variations
It's called Variations under Adjustments.
under
And-
adjustments, okay.
And it shows you, I use it a lot when I'm just trying to get a rough feel for what's wrong with an image. It's not too good for precision work. It'll give you a rough feel for it.
When you say variations, is that kind of like a color or a proofing?
Yep. You can do hue and saturation in it and 2 or 3 other things, and we'll give you the little images to show fundamental changes, and you can pick one to start doing your real work on. We all know there's a world of difference from this little anaglyph to a real high quality one.
That's
Okay.
that's really fun to do in actual photographic process.
Yeah. Okay, you can take your glasses off. We're getting out of this now. Okay, so you made one. You went through this process. You went through all the setup and stuff, and you followed it through, and you look at it and you don't like it. Okay, so what happened to it? You know, that's one of the things that is so hard for me when I'm doing something new. It doesn't come out the way I wanted, and I usually have no idea why. So I'm going to walk through the fundamental problems you can have with one of these and what caused it. First of all, is it fuzzy? Okay? Depth of field is extremely important when you're making a phantograph. You want to make sure you set your camera up so that you have good depth of field and a good sharp focus across the whole image. And the reason you want to do that is because we're going to introduce some blurring when we do this process. There's something called pixel smear. When you take an image, like we had that grid and it kind of did this, it got smaller up at the top, and we reached up with Photoshop and we said, no it's not, it's this big. Well, if there were 100 pixels between these 2 points when we did that, and we pulled it back out here and they're now 300 pixels, where did those other 200 pixels come from? It made them up. And it did it by kind of averaging or some algorithm to create those. What it looks like in the real world is still a little out of focus. It suddenly gets a little fuzzy. Then we turned around and we sized it to a different size. That also added some new pixels that weren't there before. And the fuzz got a little worse. The more that you do that, the worse the image looks. And it's kind of fun because it's okay at the bottom of the image and it gets worse and worse and worse as you go up toward the top of the image. The taller the object is, the worse this problem is. You want to use as many pixels as you possibly can. You want to use as sharp a focus as you possibly can when you start. And be careful of the temptation to blow this image up, especially with a digital camera, because then you're going to start out with very few pixels to start with if you have to crop it much. That's what causes fuzz. The next thing is you're going to find that it's a little distorted. If the image does this, if it's a person and it leans away from you, it means you had the interocular too small for you. It might not be too small for somebody else, but it was too small for you. If it leans forward into you, you had the interocular too large. So if you shot it at 70 millimeters, try shooting it at 65 millimeters. It may straighten up for you just fine. The reason why this isn't such a super problem is most people, when they look at these, they do this. So they kind of correct for some of the distortions themselves. If it's too tall, if it looks kind of stretched out, then probably when you typed in that scale number to put the grid back to the right size, you typed in the wrong number and you got it too big in one direction. Too short, same problem, it's probably too small. If it looks kind of squat and compressed, like melted wax kind of effect, sort of partially melted, that's a particular problem, and that's that the perspective was too large or too small when we shot this. I really should have done a slide to show this, but if you think about it, if I set the camera up, if I'm looking at this on the tripod, and I set the camera up like this, it falls down through here and it falls somewhere like this, 45-degree angle. If I just move the camera higher and step back from it, okay, now when I shoot, I'm still at a 45-degree angle, but I fall someplace else on this plane. As I get the camera higher and higher on this, I'm changing that perspective depth more and more. You want to avoid having it too high, you want to avoid having it too low. You're just going to have to fool with it for each object. Usually between 25 inches back from the object and 35 inches is a really good number. And if it's 25 and 35, it needs to be 25 and 35 high to keep your 45-degree angle. 35 degrees, I shoot a lot of things so that Suzanne can see them. She's a lot shorter than I am. She reaches out like this, and then her hand doesn't reach out nearly as far. So I shoot them for 25 degrees. I shoot the ones I'm looking at myself for 36 inches. If you look at the 4 upstairs, the seashell was shot at 40 inches roughly. So you have to stand back like this to actually see it the way it's supposed to look. The other 3 were shot at about 25 inches, so you have to do this to see them. You want to take into it, you want to keep in that range when you're shooting these guys. The image plane itself, one of the most common problems you see with phantographs is you look at it and, okay, it looks pretty good, except that, my goodness, it's kind of tilting off to one side, or it kind of sinks into the back or sinks into the front. This is usually caused by the fact that perspective correction is wrong. When you put those lines up to do it and you selected those targets, you didn't do a good enough job of it. If you get them off a little bit to one side, then it will change the appearance of that plane. It will suddenly become, it'll have depth when it's not supposed to, either up or down. If it's tilted to one side, the perspective correction, if it's tilted this way, you probably did it differently in the two images. You may have been off. One may be right, but the other one is off. That will produce a tilt like this. If it tilts toward a corner, you didn't have the camera parallel to the image when you shot it. So if you look at it and it kind of slopes off in one corner, in any one of the corners, that's a really good sign you didn't have the camera parallel. Some last thoughts on this. First, when you go to shoot, always check your setup. You know, you spend 30 minutes setting this thing up, and you walk out, and your wife comes up and puts the lens cap back on the camera because she likes to protect your lenses, and bumped it. And you come back up and you take your photos, and you go down, and they don't work, and you don't know why. So even if you just set it up and walked away from it, I always go back and shoot one of those test grid photos and process it right quick. It only takes a few seconds once you get used to it. This is supposed to be a fun activity. When you first start doing this, it's going to be more than a little frustrating. But remember, it is supposed to be fun. You can produce some images that people that look at them will go, wow! You know, you show them your slide that you spent hours on and climbed half of a mountain to take, and they say, oh, that's nice. You show them the Phantogram you shot on your tabletop, and they go, wow! You know, it's a little disturbing sometimes. Some of the information on the historical side of this came from people on Photo 3D. So, I can't pronounce Abraham's last name, so I won't even try. But Closwick, Bruce Springsteen, Boris Starostra, and Owen Western. It's an area where there's a lot of rumor and a lot of speculation and not a whole heck of a lot of real documentation. And that ends the presentation. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to try to answer them. Yes?
To get the effect of, for instance, a teacup being sunk into the plane with the edge, top edge, even with the plane, just in that point where you're setting the plane, you just bring it up to the top.
Won't work. If you want to do that, what you actually have to do is take a sheet of paper and cut a hole in it, and put the teacup in the hole where it just comes up to the top of the piece of paper, and then you
picture that way,
and shoot the picture that way. Here's the thing to remember about Phantograms. Unlike a lot of things that we do, Phantograms are they produce a real virtual image. They emulate the way that your eye actually sees something, the way your brain processes it when it sees it. And it's very hard to fool your brain. So you have to shoot the setup the way you actually want it to look. You can't play with it afterwards very successfully. I mean, I know that Terry Wilson and Boris and a few other people who have really good artistic eyes can take these and they can sort of tug around on them in Photoshop and they can come up with something that looks pretty good. Though I have challenged them to do that and let me measure the original object and go back and measure their image. And so far they haven't taken me up on it. But, anything else?
Well, you mentioned Owen's a patent on the process, and how would it affect any pictures you take?
You know, I have a friendly relationship with Owen, and I'm simply not going to comment on that patent. I have my own opinions about it. And a lot of very interesting patents get issued in this society. If I were going to do something commercially with Phantograms, I would certainly talk to Owen first, discuss it with him. But that's up to you and your legal advice. Sometimes I wonder how certain patents get issued. That's a whole other issue. I've made a lot of these using a lot of different methods. If you're thinking about using one of the others, I might be able to answer some questions on it as well. The only thing I can't give you help with is making anaglyphs. I'm very distraught with my inability to do that.
Well, another question I had was, is it possible to get a soft copy of the movies that you showed us?
I'm going to put a version of this up on our website, which will have, it won't actually have the movies because we can't afford the bandwidth to show them, but it will have enough stills from them that you'll be able to follow what we're doing there. And also, this gentleman sitting here with a video camera is very likely to be selling a DVD of how to do this if my performance wasn't too bad today. Any other questions? If anybody makes these and wants some advice on them because they're having problems, by all means, feel free to email me. If you come up with any information about them that I haven't found, I'd like to compile a big database of information on Phantograms because I'm just fascinated with this kind of image. Please send it to me. I have a nice little selection of carefully crafted images I've made that I'm fairly proud of, and I'll give them to you if you can give me some information about it. So you'll get a nice little prize for it.
Do you sell your Phantogram?
I do not do commercial photography, period. This is strictly a hobby for me. And I trade them. I will trade Phantograms for other people's stereo work. I'll trade other stereo images for other people's stereo work, but I do not actually sell them.